Right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for sparing your Saturday evening with us. On behalf of IFA Southern Region Chapter, my name is Sudarshan, and I'm extremely excited and privileged to have you all for what is going to be, as I mentioned, a very exciting session and topic. Because normally, we always say interesting, but then I would rather put it exciting because this is one topic which is in creating a buzz. I would put it this way: a new kid in the block, which has been creating a lot of buzz and sensation. So probably we thought let's get into the excitement bandwagon and then try to decode, decipher what exactly is this excitement, is the buzzword. So these are some aspects which we at TFSRC thought we'll contemplate and then do it. And one apprehension we had on being a Saturday evening and especially with the IPL season going on, we were worried. Normally the weekends always been double headers, but then thankfully the IPL organizing committee decided that there's much better double header blockbuster this particular session. So thankfully we don't have anything the 4:30 slot, rather replaced by, I'm sure, what is going to be to put it in IPL terms, a dhamaka of a session, considering the buzz around the topic, which is the International Financial Services Center, specifically focusing on the Gujarat IFSC. Now, I'm not going to spend my time introducing the two erudite speakers, because when we felt at SRC, the organizing committee felt, we need to bring erudite speakers, and we couldn't think beyond Anish and Sanchit to do it for us. And what we also wanted to do is not restrict ourselves only to the taxation part of it. Largely at IFA, we've been focusing on the tax part, but then we wanted to complete, being a new kid in the block, let's try to give a holistic flavor to it, try to have a major chunk of it. And that's when we thought we'd also have a legal regulatory framework as well, to have a holistic overview of IFSC. And that's how we brought in Sanchit. As I mentioned to you, if I start introducing them formally, I'm sure this session will not be enough considering the amount of encomiums I can keep pouring on Anish as well as and Sanchit. And especially, Anish is very familiar with the fraternity as well. But very, very briefly, Anish, as you all know, is a qualified and renowned chartered accountant based out of Bombay. He's partner with the EY Financial Services, and more importantly, very familiar with us as the president of the Chamber of Tax Consultants, where he keeps feeding us with enormous amount of knowledge over the last 1 year during his tenure. So thank you very much, Anish, for sparing your time with us. And then Sanchit is a lawyer and advocate by profession, and he's a principal associate with IC Universal Legal. Again, his major focus areas have largely been into the financial services side, with specific focus on SEBI, RBI, fund formation, and he's had some very good ground level experiences on the gift implications as well. So I think we've got as a gift two erudite speakers to talk about on the gift. Uh, just a housekeeping in terms of how we have structured this session is as elucidated before. The idea is to give a holistic picture, and so therefore what we have done is we've also wanted to not necessarily stop with the academic part of it. What I mean is not the regulations and the overview, but also we have factored the structure of the program in such a manner that some of the ground level difficulties or hurdles, that at the end of the day, this is a kit which is a lot of building blocks, but then having being said as a kit, so there are some stumbles, hurdles possible. So how can these hurdles being overruled? What are the possible avenues to get away and ensure that the kid doesn't get injured and walk freely is what our objective is. So we have also factored some ground level nuances as well. How we are going to go about is we have divided into three parts. Part one, Anish will begin and set the tone in terms of how the evolution or the origins of the genesis of the IFSC or the offshore financial centers, as we all are familiar with colloquially. And then we will digress to Sanchit, who will touch upon the legal and regulatory aspect, and then we'll come back again with Anish to round it up on the tax aspects. And then we'll be happy to take up questions post the sessions. Alternatively, I would be really happy if all the participants can, put key in your questions in the Q&A box. I repeat, please put in the Q&A box, not in the chat box. So it'll be easy for us to dish out the questions and pass it across to the speakers. So please throw in your questions to Q&A, possibly subject to the speaker's concurrence. We will also take it at the end of each part. So without much further ado, I will hand it over to Anish to set the tone in terms of, because I understand Anish was also part of it from the time when it was evolved, the talks of it being coming in Bombay, and then eventually the kid moved to Gujarat. I know, we thought let's go a few steps back, but then this is a very long step back in terms of how this evolved, and also possibly, give us a flavor of how the offshore financial sectors, and a comparative perspective in terms of how other jurisdictions are. And I do know that the government is very particular that they don't want to compare this with others and create its own niche. And probably here, Anish, in terms of whether the gift has its own niche as well. So over to you, Anish, to set the ball rolling.
Thank you, Sudarshan. A very warm welcome to all of you, ladies and gentlemen, on this Saturday evening. And I promise that we'll not keep you from the IPL match. Even I am keen to see Mumbai Indians play. So, therefore, we will not keep you from the IPL match. My gratitude and my thanks to Sudarshan and the IFA Southern Region chapter for inviting me over. My privilege and my pleasure to be with all of you. Want to acknowledge and thank two of my colleagues who are there in the audience today, Diksha Manchanda and Smith Joshi, who have helped me prepare the presentation. So as Sudarshan said, what we will do is that we will, go into the genesis or the overview of the IFSC to start with, and stop there, and then let Sanchit take over, and after which we will go back to the tax part. Uh, I will just, request all of you to bear with me while I present, because I would believe that I will stop my video. The reason is nothing, but I have very high myopia, so for me to look at the screen is a little difficult, but you know, I hope that that should not be a challenge. I will come back when we have to answer any questions or when I am not looking at the slide. So really, to kind of just set the context, this is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to look at the origins of the IFSC and how it evolved, etc. And then we're going to look at uh, the advantages of the IFSC, and then let Sanchit go over and then come back with the tax amendments. And I have listed down the tax for different tax implications for different type of industries, such that it would be easier for you to contextualize it. So really moving very quickly, as Sudarshan rightly said, the idea of an international financial services center in India first came in 2007. This is the brainchild of our current Prime Minister, who was then at that time the Chief Minister of Gujarat, where I think what was observed was that the offshore financial centers in the rest of the world don't necessarily deal with transactions which are where the counterparties are one of the, where one of the counterparties is a resident of that particular country. So to take an example for London does not only have transactions which a British person enters into with a non-British person, right? It also deals with transactions, and transactions are entered into in London, where a non-British person deals with another non-British person. And the idea then was that, can we, given the fact that India has so much talent in terms of, number one, a very young population, as we know, I think 25% of our population is below the age of 35. So we have a very young demographic dividend, and can we look at this demographic dividend and set up a financial services center? So in 2007, there was a committee set up under the chairmanship of a gentleman called Percy Mistry, where Bombay or Mumbai as a financial services center was envisaged. And there was a report which was prepared in terms of what could be done to make Mumbai into a financial and international financial services center. And that report, came out, I think, in late 2007. And it was being considered and being looked at by various stakeholders. In the meantime, the Lehman crisis happened and the global financial crisis of 2008 happened, where everything got kind of completely derailed. And, forget financial services center, that I suspect the future of financial services itself was in a bit of a quandary at that point in time. And therefore, the idea of a financial services center kind of just took a back burner. But what had happened by that time was that the Special Economic Zones Act 2006 was already in place. And, the concept of a multi-services special economic zone was always there in that act. And the International Financial Services Center, in a way, in terms of legal framework, is a SEZ under the Special Economic Zones Act. It is a multi-services SEZ, so you can do a lot of things there in terms of the actual legal permissibility of transactions. So that was already in place. And then, GIFT as an entity was formed, Gujarat International Financial Services Tech City Limited, which was a joint venture between the government of Gujarat and infrastructure for ILFS, Infrastructure Leasing and Financial Services. And, these two started, thinking about what could be done in terms of activities, what is possible, what is not possible, so on and so forth. So that journey started somewhere, I think, in the beginning of the year 2010. And, again, when people spoke to the regulators, which is RBI, SEBI, IRDA, because financial services is obviously very, very regulated here in India. The first reaction was that, oh, we are creating regulatory arbitrage here in India, and therefore let's not kind of go down this route. And things, started moving very, very, very slowly indeed. Even as far as tax, is concerned, because the idea was that we need, or the concept needed to bring in onshore those transactions which were currently being done offshore by two third country counterparties. And therefore, the whole idea somewhere seemed to be preposterous for a country like India, because the thought process was, oh, but why would somebody come to India, right? And what is it that India can offer? And the GIFT, management at that time was very clear that we will offer a world-class physical environment. So, today, even if you go to GIFT, right, you have very, very wide roads inside the zone. It is about 15 to 20 minutes away from Ahmedabad airport. It is about 20 minutes away from the twin cities of Ahmedabad and Gandhinagar on each side. So one side you can go to Gandhinagar, the other side you can go to Ahmedabad. There are certain things which have been developed on the infrastructure side, like for example, there is a district cooling system. So all the AC in any building in GIFT comes from a central unit, right? And the AC works quite well, I can tell you, even in the heat of May in Ahmedabad. There's also a garbage disposal system where all the garbage disposal is done through underground tunnels. So therefore, you will not see any garbage truck, moving around in the GIFT city at all. Everything happens underground. So some of these infrastructural things were at that time conceived of and thought of. And there was also a plan to develop a robust physical infrastructure. It's not that this is just one building, for those who have seen Labuan, Labuan is just one building where you have, on the first X number of floors, I think it's 9, small offices of each of the players who, are in the zone. And on the top floor, the regulator sits. It's not like that. there is a proper, physical infrastructure. There are office buildings. There are plans for building residential zones. There's already a demarcated residential zone. There's plans for a hospital. A school is already operational by the Jamnabai Narsi school there in, it's a very renowned school in Mumbai, which has already set up a school in Ahmedabad. And people not only from the GIFT City, but in and around also go to that school. So the whole point is that there is an idea to create not only a booking center, but there is an idea to create a whole physical infrastructure and ecosystem which helps develop Ahmedabad as a financial services center. Okay, and all of this happened till and small steps happened till the government changed in 2014, where the BJP government or the NDA government really came into power. And because the Prime Minister had this as his pet project, things started actually moving very, very fast. So the regulators were called and told that, look, we want you to issue guidelines for operationalizing of units in this GIFT City. So on 1st of April 2015, the Prime Minister actually came and inaugurated the GIFT City office. And also at that time, regulations were released, and everywhere when Vibrant Gujarat happens, GIFT is a very integral part of the events there. And there is also everywhere, every time in Vibrant Gujarat, there is a conclave which is held in GIFT in that sense. So in 2015, the regulations got in place. 2016, the NSC set up its own wholly owned subsidiary as an exchange. 2017, BSE set it up. And in 2019, a unified regulatory authority was set up, because it was felt that when RBI, SEBI or IRDA look at the center, they kind of, look at uh, the, the whole of India as a constituent rather than a particular center. So it was decided that there needs to be a unified proper regulator on the lines of, say, something like DIFC, which has its own regulator. And, the regulatory authority was set up. And in 2020, all the appointments, etc., were done. So today the authority is in place. The chairman is a very dynamic gentleman called Mr. Injeti Srinivas. And the authority also has representatives of all the three regulators, and it is functioning very, very well. If you've been following, the developments, quite a few regulations have already come up, and as recently as last night, there have been regulations notified for setup of stock exchanges, clearing corporations, so on and so forth. So, there is a lot that is happening on the ground there. Now, what is the presence there? Right? And the presence is about 19 insurance and reinsurance entities are there, where the sum insured is about more than 30 billion US dollars. It has 14 large banks which has set up their branches there, the IFSC banking units. 2 foreign banks have set up. And the banks have volumes of about 26 billion US dollars. The 2 international exchanges and clearing corporations where daily trading is about $4 billion have been set up, the BSE and NSE, as I was talking about. Around 100 stockbrokers and intermediaries are there. And there are more than about 140 products. And these are some of the names which are there to the right of my slide, where you can see, names like, the biggest of the big in that sense, ICICI, Lombard, or, IDBI Bank, Axis Bank. And the foreign banks are actually Citi and HSBC who have set up there. So what is the IFSC unit feature? Right? This is a specifically delineated, completely duty-free enclave, which is aimed to be the hub of financial services transactions. which, as I explained, seeks to bring to Indian shores overseas financial services transactions and offers a business and a regulatory environment comparable to other leading financial services in the world. And it is ranked third by the Global Financial Centers Index as one of the, it's third out of 15 centers that are likely to become more significant in the next few years. So in terms of regulatory framework, as we said, it's a unified authority. It is a unit in the IFSC is considered as a non-resident for FEMA purposes. It's very important to remember that the transactions in the IFSC unit can be done only in foreign currency, except for certain specified, transactions which can be done in INR. And as Sanchit and I will delve into this, we will speak about some of the transactions in INR that can be done. But essentially, you're supposed to transact in foreign currency, except for paying off local expenses which have been done in rupee transactions and certain specific transactions that the government permits. Right. The income tax we'll talk about, but essentially there's a 10-year tax holiday for a unit. There's a MAT of 10.48%, which is half of the current MAT rate. There's no custom duty on any imports. There's no GST on any output supply. There's a stamp duty exemption. There are certain corporate law relaxations like CSR, etc. And there are certain other state incentives, like there's some electricity duty reimbursement. Government of Gujarat picks up certain PF for the employees, etc. So I'm going to not go about the recent developments. What I will do is I am going to leave the slides with IFA. I'll mail them and they can circulate these slides to you. Essentially, what are the strategic advantages? Kind of we've just spoken about, but very, very quickly, the whole idea is not a tax arbitrage. The whole idea is lower cost, where if you do a transaction between two third-party, country residents in, say, a London or a Hong Kong or a Singapore, there is a particular cost attached to doing that transaction. Because you can't do that transaction without people, you can't do the transactions without a particular office space, etc. And the advantage in India is you can get similar sort of people, office space also, but at a much lower cost. And which is where the idea is that, you get, concentration of companies, talent cost is lower, talent is available aplenty because Indians understand financial services. India also has a large English speaking population, and India has a decent education system, so you churn out MBAs quite by the dozens. And then there is space availability, of course, in Ahmedabad, unlike in Bombay. There are rental concessions that the government of Gujarat gives. There is uninterrupted network. There is proper BCP done. All the IT infrastructure has been taken care of very well. In fact, last April there was a fire in the GIFT City premises, but they were up and running immediately. There was no interruption in their connectivity in anything. So I think this is really nice. Again, in terms of cost of living, it is lower as compared to anywhere else. The idea is to have a proper social and social infrastructure and a physical infrastructure where you will have in that area a hospital, school, so on and so forth. And as people start living in and around there, the whole ecosystem will build. Again, the concept is, walk to work, where people would want to just walk to work, and therefore transportation and connectivity are there. Government is firmly behind the development. It is aimed at ease of doing business. And of course, India is a very geopolitically stable country. Again, the tax incentives we're not going to talk about. These are the areas where, and this is the last slide I am going to talk about before I hand over to Sanchit. Really, these are the areas where GIFT is currently focusing on. So it's banking, there's asset and wealth management, there's listing of equity bonds, REITs, InvITs, GDRs. There's going to be an international bullion exchange, which will set up soon. There are already regulations for aircraft leasing and financing where, in terms of at least tax, the treatment is very, very similar to what you get in, say, in Ireland today. There's insurance, reinsurance, and there is high-end processing and global in-house centers or captives. So with that, let me pause here and let me stop sharing the screen. I can only assure you that there is a proper physical infrastructure there. It's not that there is just one building. There is, there are office buildings, there is a clubhouse there already. There is a school there. There are residence projects which are also being planned. Rentals are about 50 rupees a square feet. So with that, let me stop and let me hand over to Sanchit to take this forward. After which I will come back again with the tax proposals.
Perfect. Thank you, Anish. That was a good overview in terms of what are the unique value propositions that the Gujarat IFSC can provide. So I will let's move on to the part 2 of it, where we'll touch upon the legal regulatory. Sanchit will take over. Sanchit, one of the issues, at least from my perspective, I've always seen when a new stuff comes in is the the regulatory implications. So do you believe the IFSC has a light touch and a principle-based regulatory regime which will complement with whatever the unique propositions which Anish dwelled upon in the earlier segment?
And okay. First of all, thank you, Anish, for providing such a great gist of how IFSC has evolved till date, and thank you, Sudarshan, for giving the kind introduction. And thank you, everyone, for joining in. So before I formally commence my presentation, I would like to give a brief gist as to how IFSC regime has evolved and the relevance of it. So right now, we all understand that the markets have been pretty compelling, right? In the past, due to COVID outbreak, we saw a dip in the market, and then the markets bounced back pretty well. So from that perspective, and also if we see the kind of inflows we have in FPI and FDI, it has been pretty tremendous, right? Now the question arises that who have been one of the key beneficiaries of such great inflows and the growth story of India? And the answer is pretty obvious, that one of the key beneficiaries have been the offshore jurisdictions, right? Jurisdictions such as Mauritius, Cayman Islands, Singapore, wherein the offshore investors have typically pooled in their money and then allocated or feeded that into India through the FPI route or through the FPI route. Now, along with that, the service providers as well of such offshore jurisdictions have also been beneficial with respect to the fact that they have provided the services for setting up that particular vehicles and for up and running. Now, what will a government do? Government will obviously want that the benefits which other people, such offshore jurisdiction people, are rendering from the India growth story, that comes back to the Indian side, and hence the advent of IFSC. Particularly when we see or hear the Honorable Finance Minister in the budget speech, she specifically mentioned that what is important is not just to have new vehicles set up in GIFT IFSC, but also the relocation of already set up offshore investment vehicles back to India. It clearly tells us what the intent of our government is. With this backdrop, and I understand that the particular relocation will be tax neutral, I understand that Anish might be taken care of in his future slides. With this backdrop in place, I would like to commence my presentation. So what I have done is I have structured my presentation in 6 parts. To start with, I understand Anish has already given a great background as to how everything has evolved, the comparison with Dubai, London, for example. So what I'll touch upon is the legal regulatory aspects as to how the timeline has progressed in the past years, starting from 2015 till as recent as 2021. Followed by that, I'll deep dive into the AIF space. So I'll be specifically dealing with how AIF has evolved in IFSC and what are the nuances involved with respect to that. So on the second slide, I'll be talking about the typical structure, how AIF can be set up in IFSC. Followed by that, in third slide, I'll talk about the legal regulatory framework for AIFs. So basically touching upon the fact that how SEBI AIF regulations, which are applicable for the domestic AIFs, that are actually relevant, and how with certain carve-outs that are applicable with respect to AIFs and IFSC. Followed by that, I'll talk about the manager sponsor to AIFs. So to have a AIF running, there has to be a manager and sponsor in place. So what are the key requirements and what are the issues we are facing right now when we are actually providing our services to certain financial institutions? So what are the issues we are facing? I'll try to highlight that. The fifth slide is, as Sudarshan was rightly saying, that we are trying to capture the actual ground level issues we are facing, right? So fifth slide, I have tried to capture 7 to 8 pointers wherein actual issues we are facing while we are dealing with the financial institutions or the IFSC, the authority which has been set up. So not major, obviously, it is a lightest regulation per se, as Sudarshan was also mentioning. So not so major, but obviously something to ponder upon, and certain answers are still awaited. And then to give everyone a brief background how the registration process works, not just of AIF, but any unit. So if you want to set up any LLP or a company, how the registration process will be, what are the timelines involved. So you get a gist of how things work in IFSC. With this, I'll move on to the next slide. This is the timeline chart. So as I said, I'll start with 2015. So in 2015, Government of India announced the setting up of GIFT IFSC, which was in Gandhinagar, to actually bring the Indian entities at the equal footing with respect to the other offshore financial centers, and also providing or enabling them to have infrastructure comparable to such other offshore financial centers. Along the same time actually came the SEBI as well as RBI guidelines. What RBI provided is any financial institution, including its branch, for the purposes of foreign exchange laws will be considered as non-residents. This was followed up by SEBI guidelines, wherein SEBI prescribed that all the domestic and or other offshore institutions who want to take up activities relating to securities market can undertake subject to SEBI's approval and under the framework of securities law as in place by SEBI, subject to certain carve-outs which they provided in these guidelines. Now deep diving into the AIF aspect of it, in 2017, like till 2017, one of the issues was that there wasn't clarity whether such bodies, for example, AIF set up in IFSC, can it invest in India securities or not, like securities issued by Indian companies. This was clarified and amendments were made to state that AIF portfolio managers or mutual funds can invest in Indian securities through the FPI route. This was a very welcome move. This was quickly followed up by the 2018 operating guidelines. In this 2018 operating guidelines, which was actually one of the major boosts, which also attracted a lot of eyeballs from the financial institutions, what it said was, it provided the entire framework, how AIF as a particular vehicle will work. It provided the registration processes. It provided what will be the minimum corpus, what will be the continuing interest. So all of those things, which were, to be frank, it was at least at par with how the domestic AIFs are run and the regulations with respect to domestic AIF. Everything was brought in on paper through this operating guidelines. Now players started reviewing or seeing this particular GIFT City with respect to AIFs pretty seriously. Then came one of the major overhaul, and I would see from legal regulatory perspective, this was one of the major milestone, which was in 2019, Government of India notified IFSCA, and effective from October 2020, all the powers of all the three regulators, be it SEBI, RBI, or RDA, concerning the banking sector, the insurance sector, or the capital market sector, was subsumed in IFSCA. I believe this was one of the major boosts with respect to the development of IFSCA and the speed at which I understand it will not develop. And the reason being, we all understand that when we have to deal with different regulators, there's always time lag. There's always, we need to keep on following up with different regulators for a single mandate. And through IFSCA being set up, all of these powers, when being passed on to a particular regulator, we can easily assume, and also evident since past couple of months, we have seen a lot of circulars are being issued, a lot of things are being cleared. This was only because every power is with IFSCA right now with respect to the three regulators, and they are day in, day out issuing circulars or clearing certain issues which the market participants had, and it's progressing pretty well. Now, specifically to category 3 AIFs. Category 3 AIFs, I'll deal in my next slides, that what category 3 AIF is, just to give a brief background to the participants. But a major tax overall came in September 2020 with respect to category 3 AIFs, which brought actually category 3 AIFs at par with vehicles set up in, say, Mauritius or Singapore with respect to the debt investments or derivative investments. I believe, I suppose, like Anish will be taking care of that in his slides, in his presentation. Moving forward, with respect to AIFs, one of the bottleneck, one of the basic critique which the market participants or the financial institutions had was the applicability of the SEBI AIF regulations 2012, which are applicable for domestic AIFs, purely to the AIF set up in IFSC. Now, what was the issue? A lot of issues pertaining to co-investments. So co-investments in domestic AIF is not allowed. The same was then applicable to AIF and IFSC as well. Leveraging was not allowed for category 1, category 2, except for temporary investments, temporary funding, and that too for 30 days and not more than 4 times a year. This was also applicable squarely because the entire AIF regulations is applicable for AIFs in IFSC. Now, with respect to fund of fund, in domestic AIFs till date, either an AIF can be a fund of fund or it can invest in portfolio entities. This was again applicable to AIFs. So there were a lot of bottlenecks which did not ensure that vehicles set up in GIFT IFSC are at comparable stage to what the other offshore jurisdiction vehicles offer. So this was again done away with in this 2020 December circular. So co-investment was taken care of, fund of fund was taken care of, leveraging as well as diversification norms were taken care of. I'll deal with this in detail in my next slide. Now, coming to 2021, the finance bill. As I said, there has been talks about making tax neutral for relocation of all the vehicles set up in offshore jurisdiction. It also has certain legal nuances we need to consider, which I'll cover in my 5th slide. Okay. Now, moving on to my next slide. Now I'll deep dive into the AIF PERSE so as to give the audience just how AIF PERSE works in IFSC. The typical structure. So AIF and IFSC can raise money predominantly, obviously, from the resident outside India, person resident outside India, as well as person resident in India. So if people have been following the circulars recently issued by RBI, so under the LRS scheme, RBI has actually allowed investments in entities in set up in GIFT IFSC with respect to the resident Indians. So these two routes are available of raising money. Now, when we talk about investments by such AIFs which are set up in IFSC in the Indian market, so all the 3 routes which are available for a normal offshore investor, be it FVCI, be it FDI or a FPI, all of these 3 routes are available for an AIF set up in IFSC as well, thus making it one of the most flexible options per se available for raising money and then deploying it in the Indian markets. Then we have a lot of securities in which we can invest. Again, I'll be dealing it with the framework in the next slide. Now, the next slide is with respect to the legal regulatory framework for AIFs. So I'll provide you a gist so that you understand how the AIF structure is, how it works, and how it functions. So number 1 is of the form of AIF. So in India also, AIF can be set up either as form of a trust, as an LLP, or as a company. We have seen like 95% to 97%, I would say, are set up in form of a trust. So similar is the preference which we are seeing while we are interacting with the financial institutions, that they want to again go ahead with the trust form of structure for GIFT AIFs as well. Now, with respect to applicability of SEBI AIF regulations, as I was mentioning, how the entire AIF regulations for domestic AIF are applicable per se for AIF set up in IFSC, this has been one of the challenges. And few of the bottlenecks have been removed, which are the next 3 or 4, which I'll point out. Number 1 is the diversification limits. So what do you mean by diversification? Diversification means that you cannot just invest all the amount or all the corpus of that particular vehicle in one investee entity. So what diversification limits applicable for domestic AIFs are? For category 1 and category 2 AIFs, it has to have at least, it cannot invest more than 25% of its investable funds in one portfolio entity. That means a minimum 4 investments. For category 3, it was that you cannot invest more than 10% in one portfolio entity. That means a minimum of 10 investments to be done by category 3 AIF. So this has been done away with, which was a very welcome move. So that means an AIF in IFSC does not have to follow any diversification norms. That means for Cat 1, Cat 2, a minimum of 4 investments is not mandatory. And for Cat 3 AIF, a minimum of 10 investments is again not mandatory. This was a welcome move. Number 2, co-investments. While dealing with SEBI with respect to various fund formation, we saw SEBI's discomfort with respect to co-investments, that co-investment should not be allowed because it might disrupt the blind pooling principle of AIFs. Now, this particular thing has been done away with respect to GIFT's IFSC, specifically through that December 2020 circular I was mentioning earlier. What they proposed is that through a segregated portfolio, by issuing a separate class, co-investment can be done. obviously subject to certain disclosures, and the terms should not be more favorable. But again, this thing has allowed a particular vehicle set up in GIFT IFSC to do co-investments. Talking about leverage, as I said, leveraging was one of the issues wherein category 1, category 2 cannot undertake leverage, and for category 3 as well, there is a ceiling under the domestic AIFs. This has been done away with respect to GIFT IFSC. Now, overseas investment. So one of the critique was that GIFT IFSC will obviously be allowed to make investments overseas. But the applicability of law for domestic AIF is that overseas investment can only be made in venture capital undertakings, which means that securities which are not listed. Now, this particular and another condition was that you cannot invest more than 25% of your investable funds in overseas securities. Now, both these conditions have been done away with, because obviously now GIFT AIF set up in IFSC are used predominantly also for making overseas investment. Again, a very welcome move. Next point is on the permissible investment. So as I said, all the 3 routes available, which are FPI, FVCI, and FDI, all the 3 routes are permitted for AIF set up in IFSC to make investment in India. The permitted securities, as also mentioned in my structure I was talking about, permitted securities are number 1, securities which are listed in IFSC itself. Securities issued by companies incorporated in IFSC. So this covers the sphere of companies working and through the IFSC itself, the GIFT IFSC. The third step is with respect to securities issued by companies either incorporated in India or foreign jurisdiction. Fourth is units of other SEBI registered AIF. Now this is again coming from the FOF also, that now an AIF set up in IFSC can act as a fund of fund, thus making investment in units of other SEBI registered AIF. And the fifth is permissible investments in which a domestic AIF is permitted to invest in. Now, when we talk about permissible investments for domestic AIF, there are 3 categories. Category 1, which are predominantly the venture capital funds or the infrastructure funds. Category 2 is the private equity fund or the real estate fund, or for example, the debt fund. And category 3 is the public market fund or doing derivatives, hybrid strategies. So basis whatever strategy you want to proceed with, the said category will be utilized and the license under the said category will be taken, and hence permissible investments will be accordingly. Now talking about custodian, this is akin to what domestic AIFs are subject to. So if there is a category 3 AIF, you need to have a custodian. For a category 1 and category 2 AIF, if your corpus goes beyond 70 million, then you need to have a custodian. Obviously, it's preferable that you any which ways have custodian for category 1 and category 2 as well for safekeeping of securities. And also if you have the FPI license, then the DDP will any which ways be the custodian. So that condition will any which ways be taken care of. Now the next 2 points, the minimum investor commitment and the minimum corpus, this is again to the what the domestic AIFs are subject to, and the FPI registration. Now when we talk about the FPI registration, one of the important things is the preferred category, which is category 1 FPI, which is the appropriately regulated one. This has been also given the GIFT AIF set up in GIFT IFSC have also been given the status of category 1 FPI. That was a very welcome move. Apart from that, all the investment conditions, be it be for the equity, for the debt, for the NRI, OCI, RI participation, all of those things remains the same as it is for a normal FPI. Moving on to the next slide, which I said might be of some interest with respect to manager sponsor, because it also depends how you structure the AIFs in IFSC. You need to have a sponsor and manager for formulating an AIF. So who can set up a particular AIF? An existing sponsor. So if there is an existing sponsor of an India AIF, it can either set up a branch or incorporate a new company or an LLP in IFSC to act as a manager or sponsor. If it's a first-time manager, then there is no possibility of setting up just a branch. Then they have to go through that subsidiary route wherein the LLP or the company needs to be formed. Continuing interest for the manager as well as sponsor, it remains the same akin to what domestic AIFs are subject to. Roundabout for category 3 is 5% of the corpus or USD 1.5 million. And for Cat 1 and Cat 2 AIF is lower of 2.5% of the corpus or USD 750,000. This is at par with what the domestic AIFs are subject to. Now, team of the manager. This I will also like to answer Sudarshan's query as well. When he was mentioning that this is a light touch regulation and the way GIFT IFSC has evolved, so it should evolve swiftly. So yes, it is a light touch regulation, but that should not be misunderstood to say that the monies are not secured with respect to vehicles set up in such GIFT IFSC, because right now, when we talk about specifically AIFs, it is light touch to a certain extent because it is for sophisticated investors, number one, and the requirement for a manager to act as a manager for AIF is that you need to have minimum 2 employees, and either both of them together or one of them individually has to prescribe or has to have this particular minimum qualification, which is a minimum of 5 years of experience in advising or managing pools of capital. That means managing third-party money in CRISP, and should have a professional qualification in finance, accountancy. He may be a CA or he may be a CFA. So if there is one person and a team of 2, or if 2 of them combined takes care of these 2 requirements, then you are good to go to act as a manager. Now coming to key regulatory issues, I would like to address all the 6 points, because these 6 points are something which we are facing while providing our services to the financial institutions, that how to take care of these things. Number one is RBI approval for resident sponsor. So as I was mentioning in my last slide, that if there is a sponsor who is already acting as a sponsor manager for a domestic AIF, he can just set up a branch. So for setting up a branch, the JVWS will not kick in, the RBI regulations per se. However, if it's a new entity, then there is one level of approval you require for setting up that subsidiary. And a second approval is, because you will be transferring money from India to GIFT IFSC, which for all purposes is non-resident, and that money will again route back for making investment in Indian securities. So it should not termed as round tripping. So we need to take blessing from RBI as well. Now, this has been one of the bottlenecks, because we have seen practically that RBI is taking some amount of time to actually provide their approval or bless this particular understanding with respect to the sponsors who want to act as sponsor to certain AIFs and IFSC. So this is one bottleneck. This enhances the amount of time which is being taken to set up and make a vehicle up and running. So this is one. There are recommendations. So following the second point, the recommendations to IFSC are meeting its continuing interest. So this is related to the first point itself. So continuing interest, as I mentioned, that 5% or 10 crore rupees with respect to CAT 2 as USD, and CAT for category 1 and category 2 is 2.5% of the corpus of 5 crores, comparable to whatever the USD amount is. This continuing interest under the SEBI AIF regulations, which are applicable for GIFT IFSC, cannot be there through waiver of management fee. So what a middle ground we are trying to find through our discussions with IFSCA is the fact that we understand that RBI might take time to bless the flow of money from India to GIFT IFSC and then route it back to the Indian securities or to the Indian market. So instead of that, if the manager or sponsor are allowed to ensure this continuing interest through the waiver of management fee, this can be done by IFSCA, because right now IFSC has the power to amend the AIF regulations or carve out certain provisions which are applicable for domestic AIFs as also applicable to GIFT IFSC. So this is something which IFSC is looking into. Let's see how it gets resolved. Not resolved as of yet, but this is one of the issues we are facing. Now the third point is investment by resident Indians in IFSC AIF under NRS route. As I said in the past, in my past slides, that NRS is permitted. Now, the round tripping issue again crops in. We don't have clarity to that, because LRS money, the domestic money, is pulled in a vehicle, and then that particular money is again routed back to India. So how will round tripping look into, and how will RBI look into that? Another thing to take into consideration is the FPI route. So if there is if this particular vehicle also acts as an FPI, then you cannot invest more than 49% in the Indian securities, because then it has to be global fund. As I said, all the FPI regulations normally applicable to a normal FPI will be applicable to them. Hence, so I'll just move on to the last slide. If you see the last point over here, right? RI investment, that is resident Indian investment, is permitted in global funds whose India exposure is less than 50%. So this will be applicable, and if it's an FPI, then the round tripping issue might not crop up. However, if it's directly FDI and not FPI per se, then there will be an issue. And we are still sorting out, and let's see how this gets resolved. Now, the fourth point is relocation of current offshore fund setup to GIFT IFSC. So as I was mentioning that our Honorable Finance Minister and also the amendments being made to the taxation per se to make it tax neutral, of transferring or relocating the vehicle setup in offshore jurisdiction to GIFT IFSC. So this is good. This is great progress. This is great way to look forward. And I am sure that Anish might be covering this aspect from the tax perspective, tax neutrality perspective. But when we talk about the legal challenges, there are 2 or 3 legal challenges. Number one, it will be depending on how the regulator in that particular offshore jurisdiction take this particular shift from that jurisdiction back to GIFT IFSC. So whether approval will be required. If approval will be required, then what can be the rationale given to them? Because obviously economy, this particular vehicle is also featuring towards the economy in that particular zone, right? So we have to see, number one, that. Number two, investors or the contributors in that particular investment vehicle, their approval will also be required, either 75% or 100%. So these challenges are there. Approvals will be required. It's just not that you can just shift the structure directly from the offshore jurisdiction back to India, GIFT IFSC. So these challenges will have to be taken into consideration as and when someone crosses that bridge. Number 5 is investment manager and the alternative investment fund, either set up as a trust or an LLP or a company, to have 2 separate units. So when we talk about domestic AIF, right, so usually the address for the trust is also used for as if whatever the premises are being used for the manager. So there's just 1 unit, no twice running cost and everything, so on and so forth. But this, we are finding some issues in IFSCA. So what the issue is, what we have, the feedback we have got is, investment manager has to have a separate entity, as well as the AIF itself needs to have a separate entity, which means twice the regulatory burden, twice the expenses. So we are trying to sort it out. We are trying to put in certain recommendations as to we can merge it, because ultimately it's for a single purpose. So again, this is also abated. So this is also one of the ground level issues we are facing. And the last is the consolidated regulatory regime for AIFs and other regulated vehicles. This point is important because if this thing happens, it might give comfort to offshore clients who want to take GIFT IFSC seriously. So what it means is, right now, as I said, AIF regulation which are applicable to domestic AIF are squarely applicable to GIFT IFSC, subject to certain carve-outs. So this creates a kind of confusion to all the market participants, including offshore people who want to take GIFT seriously. So there has to be a consolidated regulatory regime. So for example, AIF, so this is the code for AIF under which the AIFs will function in GIFT IFSC. So I presume that the IFSCA, the authority, is right now taking this into consideration and planning to have a consolidated regulatory regime, but it is still a bit far-fetched. I suppose another year or 2 may take with respect to having consolidated regime, but this should happen. So this is also one of the issues we are facing. Now moving on to the next slide, just to give the attendees a gist of how the processes work in the GIFT IFSC and the timelines. So first of all, when we talk about the timelines, I would say if the RBI issue is not there, wherein we need to seek RBI approval for transferring the continuing interest from India to the GIFT IFSC, if that is not there, then ideally within 25 days, like 3 weeks to 4 weeks, we should be done with the entire process, right from application to getting the registration. Now, how will that process flow? Number one, there are 3 developers right now, as Anish was also mentioning. So there are three developers, 3 projects over there, which are one from the SEBI group, one is Hiranandani, and one is the Brigade. So you need to actually approach one of the 3 developers, finalize a particular unit, and get a PLOA. PLOA is a provisional letter of allotment, which is allotted to you subject to you providing them requisite documents like KYC and everything. So you get that PLOA, number 1. Post that, there are 2 simultaneous applications we need to do for specifically deep diving, as I said, to AIF. 2 simultaneous application. One is to the DC, that is Development Commissioner, which is of the GIFT SEZ, for getting the unit approval. And second is to IFSCA for getting AIF registered over there. So you apply, you submit Form F to GIFT Development Commission, number 1. Then they might get back to you with the queries which they may have, and then also post that there's a unit approval committee, which is I'm talking about the very first aspect of getting the unit approval. So there is a committee which we have seen in the recent past. What they're doing is they're actually asking for a one-on-one interview per se from the applicants. It is usually a video conferencing, which we are seeing happening these days, wherein they ask certain questions as to what are the future business prospects. and basis that they are allotting the units. I have not seen any issues per se over there. It's a normal process which gets done within 10-15 days itself. And parallelly, when I'm saying the IFSCA, the application with respect to getting AIF registered has to be done under Form A as prescribed under the SEBI AIF regulations, and that process goes parallelly as well. So once you receive the IFSCA registration and also you receive the final letter of allotment from the DC, the Unit Approval Committee, you have 45 days to accept it, and then you are good to run the business. So what I understand is, and what I have seen in the past, is the fact that not more than 2 to 3 weeks or maximum 4 weeks should be taken with respect to right from documentation to getting to making submission with respect to different forms, and then getting the approval post all whatever legal regulatory concerns which they may have or queries which they may have. So that's about it from my side, and I would be happy to address any queries which you may have during the end of the session. And over to you, Sudarshan.
Thank you, Sanchit. Now, there's one question, Anish, related to Sanchit. Should we do it now, or do you want to take all the questions at the end?
We can take it now. There's no problem.
Yeah. Sanchit, this question is quite fundamental, foundational. So thought we'll put it in this context. You mentioned trust is more preferred. So one of the attendees wanted to know why trust is more preferred than to an LLP or company. Obviously, there's a tax element coming in, or the AML KYC aspect coming in terms of beneficial ownership. Is that the reason?
Exactly. So from tax perspective, obviously Anish will be better placed to answer that. So first of all, it gives a lot of tax benefits, number one, and from confidentiality perspective as well, because all the participants or the partners of an LLP or the shareholders with respect to a company will be visible on the regulatory body's website per se, who are the stakeholders. With respect to trust, the confidentiality can be maintained. So these are the two primary reasons why trust is always preferred over LLP or company in the domestic area space. Anish, you may also add in with respect to taxation.
Yes, thank you. So from a tax perspective, why are AIFs really structured more as trusts as opposed to, say, LLPs or companies? For companies, the reason I believe is obvious, that there is a dividend distribution tax. So if there is a income which the AIF earns as a company, and that income gets distributed back to the shareholders, then there is a tax in the hands of the shareholder. Earlier, there used to be a dividend distribution tax. Now, with effect from 1/4/2020, there is taxation in the hands of the shareholders. So the shareholder doesn't get the income tax free. In an LLP and in a trust, that works, right? But the trust also has an advantage of two things. One is flexibility. As rightly pointed out, there is, even if I am a determinate trust, as you know, right, then my assessment is in a like manner and to the same extent as if the assessment were to be made onto my beneficiaries, right? Or if I am an indeterminate trust or a discretionary trust, then the assessment is made at maximum marginal rate. Now, an AIF is likely to earn income from capital gains. And as far as capital gains are concerned, the argument that people make, and there are tribunal decisions to this effect, that the maximum marginal rate for long-term capital gains is the rate which is applicable to long-term capital gains itself, and not the rate which is applicable on ordinary income of individuals. And therefore, the flexibility of trust is much, much higher. The confidentiality is much, much higher. The tax, in a way, is the same as an LLP in terms of what you get as an outcome, and therefore people use trusts as the easiest way of setting up of AIFs, because it is very easy to wind up also. From that perspective, it just makes a lot of sense from a setup perspective or from a structure perspective. You can have flexibility of issuing different classes of units, as Sanchit was also mentioning. So there's a lot of flexibility available in a trust constitution as compared to an LLP or a company constitution. So with that, let us move on to the, can I get sharing rights, please? With that, let us move on to the tax aspects of, the IFSC. Now, before I delve into the specific tax aspects, also, I think there is a little bit of background to be given here. as I was mentioning, the IFSC was never intended to create a tax arbitrage. Okay, it was the tax, if at all, the holiday, if at all, was only to equate the non-residents to be in the same position as if they were dealing with another non-resident outside of India. So as I was saying, that if, say, a resident of the UK operating out of London in a financial services center deals with a resident of the US, right, or brokers a transaction between, say, a US resident and a Belgian resident, for example, then he pays tax only and only in his home country. He doesn't pay tax anywhere else. And therefore, centers like Hong Kong, Singapore, etc. are very, very popular because they have very low rates of taxes as far as some of the financial services activities are concerned. Right, the headline rate of tax is about only 17%, and you get certain further concessions, etc. So therefore, your your headline tax rate can become quite low. Sudarshan, I need screen share, please. So
Sure.
the idea was to get the people to be in the same position as if they were operating out of, say, a Hong Kong or a Singapore or even a DIFC. If you know DIFC has a 50-year tax holiday. Okay. And when the first approach was made by GIFT to the CBDT, the idea was, give us, if not 50 years, a 25-year tax holiday. And the response of the CBDT at that point was that, sorry, but I have commitments as a country to the OECD and the G20 nations, and therefore I am not able to give you anything which is new. So then we went back to the drawing board and we found this section called section 80LA, where there was tax holiday given to banking units in special economic zones, where there were zones like SEEPs, where, for example, an ICICI in the good old days had a branch, and the income of that branch was granted a deduction of 100% of that branch profit for 10 years, okay, from the year in which the branch started operating. So this 80LA was kind of discovered, and then GIFT went back to the CBDT and said, look, why can't we extend the operation of this section 80LA to to the units in GIFT, because GIFT is also in a way an SEZ, and therefore you can actually go ahead and extend this. So the CBDT found some merit in this, and there were a lot of other concessions that were being asked, right? Primarily amongst them was also because we were asking so much concessions at that time, the CBDT chairperson was very furious at GIFT at that point in time. And Hasmukh Adia was at that time the revenue secretary, and the chairperson told Hasmukh Adia that, look, they want to create another Mauritius in India, and the idea was that we never wanted to create a Mauritius. And one of the concessions that we also asked was to tax the income of employees in the GIFT City at a rate which was 50% of normal. So that was what was picked up, and people started blasting GIFT City left, right, and center. But the government was different at that time. This is pre-2014. Post 2014, of course, a lot has changed, and things have happened. And as Sanchit said, on the AIF side, really the taxation and other provisions, Amendment and Relaxation of Provisions Act, actually 2020, actually created a framework for the AIFs to be completely tax neutral, as well as the migration of portfolio investments in India through the FPI route also completely tax neutral. And we'll see some of this as we go along. So if I look at a unit in the IFSC, what is it that we have as overview of tax provisions? Okay, a unit in in the IFSC. So be it a branch of a bank, be it an insurance company branch, be it a NBFC now that financial companies are permitted, be it a stock exchange, be it a broking unit, or be it a manager or manager of an AIF, is entitled to a deduction for 10 consecutive years at the option out of the first 15 years. This again was amended recently in the last budget, not the 21 budget, the earlier budget, where the tax holiday actually started from the year of operation. And then the idea was that, okay, in the first few years, maybe the unit may not earn too much of profit, and therefore, would it be fair to give the tax concession from the year in which it starts, because there could be a situation where the unit would make losses in the first few years. And the government recognized and understood that, and then they amended ATLA to say, all right, I will give you a tax deduction for any 10 consecutive years out of the first 15 years. And this is again, precedent is available in terms of our old ATIA, etc. So that was, relatively easy. Again, as we have seen in many of the other, deductions which pertain to income, from a compliance perspective, you need to obtain a report of a chartered accountant certifying the amount of profit. Here, the certification of the amount of profit is relatively easy because there's a separate balance sheet which is maintained of the unit, and that balance sheet has to be compulsorily denominated in foreign currency. Right? That's one of the regulations that is there in any of the banking, etc. Regulations, where the unit which sets up in the IFSC, and I'm not talking about funds, so we'll come to funds in a little bit, because funds are not units, funds are contracts, right? It's an obligation. A trust is an obligation, it's not an entity. But a unit has to then obtain a report of a chartered accountant in form 10 CCF, certifying that the deduction has been correctly claimed. There's also an applicability of section 88(6), right, and 88(b) and 88(c). So if you do not file your audit report, or if you do not file your return in time, then the deduction goes away. So that's an important thing that you have to remember, that your compliance has to be absolutely up to date. Plus, if you are availing services from or purchasing goods from any other related party or any part of the same enterprise, which would be applicable in case of branches, right? For example, there are certain specific things that happen centrally in any bank branch. For example, procurement of stationery, to take the very simple case, or HR, for example, or even to some extent IT. That would happen centrally. There would be, everything would be housed in one branch, and you would then avail IT services from for all the other branches from that particular branch. So all of these transactions have to be done at fair market value, and of course, there will have to be examination, and there will be domestic transfer pricing that would be applicable into, say, those units. Or even international transfer pricing if you're a foreign bank. So transfer pricing essentially will apply to you, right, when you look at a transaction between either entities of the same group or branches. Now, as far as MAT is concerned, there is section 115 JB clause 7, where a lower MAT rate of 9% plus applicable surcharge and cess, which works out, I think, to somewhere around 10.5%. will be leviable for units which are set up after on or after 1st of April 2016 and earn income in foreign currency. So it is important to understand which are these units which will be subject to a lower MAT rate, It is units which are set up after 1st of April 2016. Most units are, you don't have to worry at all. In fact, all. But the condition is that you have to earn your income in foreign currency. So if there's a local fee arrangement or a local rupee billing, then I think you may have a challenge. This is one of the anomalies that is there, because I would think that when the concept of IFSC was propounded, then the idea was that everything would happen in forex, nothing would happen in INR. But obviously, of course, when when things have changed, the scenario has changed, where some of this relocation is going to happen, and an AIF manager is going to get fees from the AIF. It has to be remembered that for avoiding the MAT, etc., the income will have to be in foreign currency. As far as transactions on the IFSC exchanges are concerned, there's no STT, there is no CTT, right? No securities transaction tax, there's no commodities transaction tax. Transactions in certain assets which are entered into on or after 1st of April 2018 in an IFSC exchange by a non-resident will not be regarded as a transfer, and hence they would not be taxable, provided, again, the consideration for that is paid in foreign currency, which is bonds or specified GDRs, rupee denominated bonds, derivatives, or certified or securities notified by the central government, right, which has been notified by a notification dated 5th March 2020 and includes foreign currency denominated bonds, units of mutual funds, units of AIFs, business trusts, and foreign currency denominated equity shares of a company. So if there's shares of a foreign company which are traded on a foreign exchange, IFSC stock exchange, then there is a tax exemption for those capital gains that you earn on those transactions. Again, as far as lending or borrowing activity is concerned, we are aware that 194 LC prescribes a withholding tax rate of 5% on certain qualifying loans. Now, if these borrowings happen by way of rupee denominated bonds or long-term bonds issued on or after 1st April 2020, but before 30th of June 2023, and these bonds are listed, then the withholding tax also goes down to 4% and not 5%. So that's again something which the government has done by way of, Now let us move on to fund management, and I think this is very, very important. Now, as we know that there is a section called Section 9A, where what happens is that if there is a fund manager who is in India, who manages offshore funds, then the activity of fund management from India of these offshore funds will not constitute a business connection in India, right? And the fear was that if there are people sitting in India who are managing offshore funds, which ultimately invest back into India in terms of, assets through either the FDI, FPI or FVCI route, then there could be permanent establishment of business connection issues. So the government a few years ago introduced Section 9A, and Section 9A says that there will be no business connection if the fund manager sits in India. Okay, but there were certain very onerous conditions put both on the fund as well as on the fund manager, where some of the conditions were very, very difficult to fulfill. One of the conditions was that the fund manager has to be paid at an arm's length. Now, we all know that India is a land of the highest transpricing disputes, right? And the most transpricing disputes since 2001 always have happened in India. India has that dubious distinction. Unfortunately, even an APA negotiated rate is not an arm's length rate technically, because it's a negotiated rate. So therefore, the challenge always has been that how do you, satisfy this arm's length rate? There's also another condition that not more than 5% of the funds investors directly or indirectly are resident Indian. Now, in a public fund type of scenario where you are like, say, a mutual fund in a foreign country, you don't even know who owns your units. So to give that declaration again becomes a very, very challenging thing, right? And therefore, the Finance Act 2021 has now actually amended 9A to say that those conditions which the government will prescribe will be relaxed for an AIF manager in the IFSC. So again, maybe, what conditions are to be relaxed is still to be notified. But typically for this 9A regime to take off, of course, there are a handful of entities who have registered under Section 9A for managing of offshore funds, but they are, I think, less than 10 in number, unfortunately. So these conditions will be relaxed for a eligible investment or a fund manager, domestic fund manager, proposing to manage an eligible investment fund in an IFSC, right, which has commenced operations before 31st of March, on or before 31st of March 2024. But again, the notification will be awaited in terms of what happens. And if some of these conditions that I spoke about are relaxed, then I think fund managers will be happy to relocate in GIFT, at least from a tax perspective. Some of the challenges that they have been facing on that count will actually be mitigated. Now, Sanchit did speak about relocation of funds and taxation of AIFs. And some of these things are, amended by the Finance Act 2021 in terms of Section 104D, Section 1023 FF, and Section 47, where 47AC, 47AD have been, amended. Now, what is the gist of all of this? There is a comprehensive exemption which is proposed for relocation of any offshore funds to the IFSC. And the terms used are, there is an original fund, which is a foreign fund, and a resultant fund, which is a category 3 AIF in the IFSC. Okay. Now, if, say, there was an existing portfolio of investments which were made in India, which currently lay in an offshore fund to the US, in, say, any other offshore jurisdiction, for example, Mauritius or Singapore. Some of these positions could be grandfathered. Some of these positions could be positions which are taken on or after 1st of April 2017, right? And the fund is investing into the Indian capital market using the FPI route. As a part of the initiative of onshoring some of these activities, right, what the government has provided is that if there is a relocation of the assets of that fund into this resultant fund, which is the category 3 AIF in the IFSC, then that relocation will be completely tax neutral. So if there is a Mauritius fund, as I said, which holds positions in Indian securities, it is registered as a category 1 or 2 FPI, and it desires to now onshore this, then it has to transfer all of these assets to the category 3 AIF. The transfer will be exempt under Section 47 7AC, right? And therefore, there will be a complete exemption. There will also be a situation where your grandfathering will also be allowed to the hands of the resultant fund. For example, you bought a position, a particular stock, say in April 2016, and you are now transferring it to this AIF. You will lose the benefit of grandfathering if ultimately you kind of transfer it, right? So in the hands of the new fund, the resultant fund, this would be a investment on or after 1st of April 2019, and therefore there would be technically full tax on the possession of the equity shares, but that has been given a complete exemption. Okay. Also, in the hands of the non-resident shareholder or unit holder in the original fund, because there will be a transfer of assets of the fund, there could also be a transfer of units of the shareholder or the unit holder, or shares or units in the original fund. It could be exchanged for shares of units of the resultant fund, and therefore that also will be regarded as tax neutral. Now, there could also be a situation where I, as a fund, may not be always investing. I could have set up a special purpose vehicle, say in Mauritius. I would be, say, a US fund. I would pool money from all the US investors. I could use another Cayman fund to pool money from non-taxable investors, and those two funds invest in a special purpose vehicle in a tax-friendly jurisdiction like Mauritius or Singapore. Then even in the hands of the wholly owned subsidiary or the special purpose vehicle of that original fund, the capital gains will be exempt, right? Even where the shares of the Indian company are relocated to the resultant fund. So it is not only available to the fund itself, it is also available to the special purpose vehicle. And as far as the resultant fund, which is registered as a category 3 AIF is concerned, right? And which is a specified fund under section 10(4)(d) of the Act. Under section 10(4)(d) of the Act, a specified fund is defined to be a fund which is established in India in the form of either a trust or a company or a LLP, which has been granted a category 3 AIF registration by the SEBI, which is located in any international financial services center, and where all the units of that fund, other than the units which are held by sponsor or manager, Sanchit referred to that I could be a resident Indian sponsor and I will have to be a resident Indian manager because I will ultimately manage the AIF from here. So to the extent of the sponsor and the manager contribution, because they also need to have skin in the game, otherwise the unit holders may not really commercially want these people to manage. So they will have to hold some units. To that extent, you could hold the units by residents, but otherwise you have to hold these units in the hands of the non-residents. So this resultant fund ultimately, whenever it transfers this capital asset, which is received from the original fund as a result of this relocation, to the extent of the income attributable to the units which are held by non-residents, which means that me, i.e. having a non-resident unit holder, to that extent, say, supposing I have 100 units, out of which, say, 2 units are held by the sponsor and 3 units are held by the manager. 95 units are held by the non-resident investors. Then to the extent of income that is attributable to those 95 units, there should be no tax because that is completely exempt under the exemption regime here under 1023 FL. And of course, cost of acquisition, period of holding, carry forward, and set off of losses are all protected. There are consequential amendments made to section 49, 56, 79, so that those sections do not apply and you don't lose any benefit of any carry forward losses which the original fund had carried forward. So essentially, we'll come back to this slide. Let me go very quickly straight to the AIF slide here. So this is a pictorial representation, really. So under, or let me go to relocation first because that was so much easier here. So this is a pictorial representation where, say, I have investors to the left, if you can see. There's an FPI entity which is there in Singapore or Mauritius, which is investing in listed securities, which has a manager and, outside of India, right? It then transfers all the portfolio holdings to this category 3 AIF, which is located in GIFT in IFSC, right? and that same thing, gets invested in, these positions are there, then really you are put in exactly the same position as if you were earlier. So you would get the benefit of exemption in respect of, grandfathered equity or debt or FNO, right? Or and the advantage is that if you say have interest income, then that interest income is taxable at 10%, right? Dividend income is also taxable at 10%. Of course, dividend may not be relevant if you have a trust structure. But yes, if the AIF earns dividend, that is would be taxable at 10%. And the advantage is there's no GAR, there's no MLI, there's no requirement of beneficial ownership. So if I look at, really what are the advantages of relocating this FPI to the AIF in GIFT? Under the SEBI FPI regulations, the entities in IFSC are deemed to be non-resident and appropriately regulated, category 1, as Sanchit did mention. If I invest in debt, bonds, GDRs, rupee denominated bonds, etc., then already there is a exemption that is available in place, right? There is deemed characterization that this will be capital assets in the hands of the AIF, and the AIF will be treated as an FPI. So 115 AD is amended to that extent, and the exemption that we talked about and the interest income that will be taxable at 10% is there. Now, if I look at very clearly in terms of how a GIFT AIF compares with a FPI in, say, Mauritius, Singapore, etc., we've done a red, amber, green type of a situation. So, of course, as far as capital gains on equity shares which are transferred on the BSE or the NSE, which is the Indian normal exchanges, are concerned, obviously both remain taxable in India, right? Capital gains on derivatives remain exempt, right? Specified securities gains on specified securities traded on the IFSC exchanges also remain exempt. Dividend and interest income get taxed at a lower rate as compared to what it would otherwise be. Of course, treaty can lower that rate also, but that would again be subject to restrict conditions like beneficial ownership, etc., or even MLI, this thing. So when I am in a MLI or GAR regime, say in a Mauritius or a Singapore, then I have a risk, or I need to look at a certain level of presence to mitigate the MLI GAR risk. Here, that MLI GAR risk in theory is not there. Of course, there will be inherent safeguards in terms of what is the presence of the manager, will the transactions of buy sell be executed from the GIFT premises, etc. All of those things will be there. So I can't have a post box entity sitting in GIFT where all the decisions of buy sell are being done in in a different jurisdiction and then just take the exemption. That is not really possible. So that's really the incentives for GIFT. Again, there is also a capital gain exemption from income, or in respect of income which is earned on investment division of offshore banking units, again, which is section 10(4)(d). The investment division of this offshore banking unit is deemed to be a specified fund for the purpose of section 10(4)(d), even though it does not issue units, and that relaxation is there. And the treatment is the same. So if there is a investment division of an offshore banking unit also, say there are large banks, large investment banks, they don't want to set up a manager entity locally. They want their own branch to be the manager of this AIF, or they want their own branch to manage their own, trading portfolios, which are India related. So there's government bonds that these banks trade, or there is equities also that they trade under the FPI route. Then all of this capital gains also would enjoy the similar exemption as you would have for a category 3. Of course, gains on equity shares would remain taxable. So from that perspective, it is treated exactly on par with a specified fund, as we said. Now, some other exemptions very quickly. If there is a non-deliverable forward contract, which a unit in an OBU, that's an offshore banking unit, OBU unit, enters into with a non-resident, a non-deliverable forward contract is a contract where you don't necessarily deliver. All that you have to do is you have to settle the differences. And this is a big market currently in Singapore, for example, where currency non-deliverable forwards happen, and banks are very interested in this activity, because it helps hedge currency risk when they have currency trading tests. So these NDFs now you can do from a unit in the GIFT City, where you will have exemption both for the IBU, which is your IFSC banking unit, because it is subject to your deduction under section 80LA, and also the hands of the non-resident. So if the non-resident has earned income on the settlement of that forward contract, then obviously that income will also be exempt. One slight language tweak here which needs to be done is that here the section 10(4)(e) basically says that income arising on transfer of an NDF. Now, sometimes the NDF may not be transferred, the NDF may come to an end and the settlement may happen, right? So the word transfer, I believe, is a little bit of a misnomer there, but I'm sure that this is not the intention, and the language anomaly will get rectified. But there is a language anomaly in 10(4)(e) where only the transfer of an NDF is talked about, and the gains arising on transfer of the NDF is exempted. Then, as far as aircraft leasing is concerned, again, the idea is to make India a hub for aircraft leasing. And as far as aircraft leasing is concerned, royalty or interest income of any non-resident which arises on account of leasing either of an aircraft, which includes any aircraft engine or a helicopter engine or any part thereof, in an IFSC, where the IFSC unit leases out that aircraft or aircraft engine, etc., then the non-resident to whom the royalty is paid is also exempt in that sense. And so therefore the structure is that there is it's similar to how you have a Ireland entity leasing out the aircraft. I'll come to that slightly later when we look at the aircraft leasing slides. And of course, when the aircraft leasing, the leased aircraft asset is transferred, then there is capital gains exemption also. So from that perspective, it is again put on a very similar part with Ireland. We've seen this, we've seen this as well. Banking also we've seen. As far as banking is concerned, we have 100% deduction for 10 out of 15 years and lower rate of MAT. Again, ECBs make inherent sense to be issued out of the GIFT branch rather than a foreign branch, because what would happen is that there would be absolute zero withholding tax and zero tax which the IFSC branch would bear because of deduction of section 80LA. So ECB or trade credit is again some products that the banks are particularly interested in looking at. Investment division we've spoken about. It is same as the category 3 AIF, the specified fund, and it can register as an FPI and do trading on the Indian stock exchanges in the same manner that today that same bank is able to do out of a Mauritius or a Singapore. Finance company, again, same thing, 80LA, lower MAT. Of course, if you are opting for the concessional tax regime under 115BAA, then MAT does not apply. that's about it. I don't think there's anything. As far as aircraft leasing is concerned, again, we spoke about this, that there is an exemption on lease rentals and interest which foreign lessor will receive from the IFSC unit, and the IFSC unit will in turn lease it to an airline company. As far as the IFSC unit is concerned, it enjoys the deduction under section ATLA for 10 years, and therefore it just pays MAT at 10.48%. Obviously, if you opt for the 115 BAA lower rate, then no MAT is applicable, but you still get ATLA. So that again is an advantage. Capital gains on sale of the aircraft or aircraft part is no there. There's no custom duty, no GST on lease of aircraft by the airline operator for use by the airline operator, and only 5% GST, which is applicable on lease rentals paid by the airlines, which is again creditable in their hands. And there's some stamp duty exemption as well. So all of this again are very, very important. Regulations do permit the operating lease of aircraft through a company or a LLP to any other prescribed person, right? Again, it covers sale and lease back, purchase, novation, transfer, assignment, etc. We've spoken about tax exemption already, lower transaction cost, and this is something that is looking at, people look at very, very, the IFSC authority is at least very bullish on the fact that it will, get a lot of people to lease aircraft to Indian Airlines or even foreign airlines from GIFT City. Of course, there are certain regulatory requirements that you have to keep a minimum capital of USD $200,000, which has to be maintained at all times. And of course, additional capital may be prescribed depending on scale of operations, etc. So it is not a complete booking center. Again, as far as insurance companies is concerned, the driver again is ATLA, and you will get a 10-year tax holiday. For life insurance, again, there is no MAT, and therefore that again makes a lot of sense. I'll just touch upon this briefly for the next 2 minutes, and then we can end and take question answers. GIC's global in-house centers are also something that the IFSC authority is looking at. And what they are saying is that if I am an entity which exclusively cater to my financial services group, where the entities which are located in FATF compliant jurisdictions and are provided, then I am allowed to set up in the IFSC for providing these support services, and I will get a concessional, the tax holiday as if I was an approved unit, and therefore I will get these deductions as well. Of course, again, some of the considerations that are there are, as compared to say a Bangalore or a Hyderabad or a Chennai or a Delhi, is there talent available? The answer is that as of now, maybe the talent is more available in these cities. The other point also, as Sudarshan mentioned, is that currently Gujarat is a dry state, though there is talk that alcohol will be permitted within the IFSC area of GIFT. So GIFT as a city has 3 different zones. One zone is the domestic tariff area, where of course there are no tax concessions at all. The other is an SEZ area, where you can set up some of these GICs or any other back office unit. And the third is an IFSC unit or area, where you can set up only financial services regulated entities like your AIFs, like your banks, like your insurance companies, etc. And the talk is that you may get IFSC area to be permitted for alcohol, but of course that again is a bit away. As far as indirect taxes for any unit are concerned, really on import of goods, there's no custom duty or no cess or no IGST, as SEZ is regarded as a territory outside of India for customs purposes. Import of services are exempt from GST. Pardon me, I'm not a very, I'm not no expert on GST, so I'm just saying all of this from my rudimentary understanding. I won't be able to answer any complicated questions, but let me just outline that. Again, procurement of goods and services from vendors in India can be procured as a zero rated supply, and therefore there's no GST payable. Of course, supplier is required to file the letter of undertaking. As far as electricity stamp duty registration fees are concerned, again, Gujarat IT policy provides for certain relaxations. Gujarat government has also, said that for the first 5 years, if there is a woman which is employed in your establishment in the IFSC, then 100% of the PF, and if there's a man employed in your establishment, then 75% of the PF will be borne by the Gujarat government. So, there are things that the Gujarat government also does. Under the IT policy, as I said, there's no electricity stamp duty or registration. As far as export of services are concerned, they are zero rated. Of course, a letter of undertaking is required, and the refund, if at all there is, of inward GST, then it is available in case any input tax is charged. So with that, I think let me, conclude this. I would want to thank Sudarshan, IFA, Southern region for a very, for this opportunity, and thank all of you for a patient hearing. Thank you very much. And of course, my thanks to Sanchit also for setting the context for the tax very, very appropriately. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Anish, and thank you to Sanchit as well. As we envisaged, the idea was to give a holistic picture, and I'm sure we're extremely happy that we were able to achieve the objective that we sought for when we structured this, conceptualized this particular session. Now that we're extremely running short of time, we'll just take two questions. I've got one in the chat from Navneet. Navneet is also one of the members in the IFA SRC who was instrumental in putting this together. The question from Navneet is, are there any, I think largely to Sanchit, are there any regulatory challenges where investment manager is located outside IFSC? And how are AIFs managing the requirement for a presence in the IFSC? Are they all setting up a branch with 2 or more employees?
Okay, so the first query, whether regulatory challenges. So number one is we mentioned that a new time manager sponsor needs to set up a LLP or a company to act as a manager sponsor. So regulatory challenges, not necessarily they have to actually set up a LLP or a company and then act as manager or sponsor. So that needs to be done. And when we talk about the substance per se, right? To have minimum of 2 employees, or how IFSCA has been looking into it. So I would say that IFSCA is pretty clear that it should not be a shell company. There has to be some substance over there. So to have 2 employees or 5 employees, how the entire management needs to be done, it has to be there. So it cannot just be a shell company. They are pretty particular to that aspect. So yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, right, Sanchit. They are very flexible in terms of, what is the kind of presence. Even if you start small and then say that I will scale up over the years, I think they're pretty flexible there. So the regulation is quite, they are friendly regulators.
That's
Anish,
right.
Thanks, Anish. There's a question for you, Anish. I'll read it out. In case of brokerage trading, IFSC trading unit located in the GIFT city, are such units required to deduct withholding tax under section 196D on trading incentive received from the IFSC stock exchange and pass the same to their FII clients?
So again, the 196D responsibility is not there on the broker. It is on somebody who pays income to the FPI. And that income will only be in the nature of dividend or interest, right? Which the the company which is paying the dividend or interest will discharge. So they will have to devolve some sort of devise some sort of a mechanism where you will give a declaration to the company to say that I am an entity which is located in the IFSC and I am covered by section 115 AD such that I have a 10% rate instead of a normal 20% rate. It's like taking a treaty declaration. It's the same sort of declaration that one may have to take.
Okay. One more question. I'm tempted to take this on the FEMA
Sure.
implications. Since IFSC is treated as person resident outside India, whether investment from China, Pakistan are regulated in light of the recent development?
So at least I haven't had any experience of that. I don't think government of India will be that magnanimous. I would be very surprised if it is. But yes, today at least I have no client who has asked me this question as of now. I don't know whether Sanchit has.
No, same here. I'll agree with what you said actually.
Maybe if I have the privilege of being the host, can I ask a question to Sanchit? Sanchit, one aspect which, from my understanding of IFSC that seems to be conspicuously missing is the dispute resolution framework. Let's take
right.
Dubai FSA. I think they've been way ahead in terms of innovation, bringing the top class dispute resolution system in terms of bringing online blockchain, the smart codes. What is your take on it? Because India generally has an adversarial regime in mind, like that's principle based, but I think this particular piece seems to be missing. What are your thoughts on this?
Should be the ideal progression actually to have a separate legal system for this particular IFSC as well. So right now there are works around with respect to arbitration. So SIAC is single arbitration is being proposed over here in IFSC, but having a separate legal regulatory system so as to give comfort to all the offshore investors as well, that they don't have to go through the entire loophole with respect to how the Indian judiciary works. That will be a major impetus and should be on the cards, not right now, but in coming years, obviously that should be the natural progression as well.
It will be. This has already been brought to the attention of the government in the good old days when we, engaged in a dialogue with the government with the concept in the first instance. So they are aware of this. Obviously, there are challenges in terms of, getting this done, for a particular zone in the country. But the first step towards the Singapore International Arbitration Center is already there. You can actually, they have a presence here in GIFT, and you can actually do a SIAC arbitration there. But of course, the governing law still continues to be, unfortunately, Indian law, which has gradually, because DIFC, as rightly pointed out by Sudarshan, has its own, governing law. And, therefore, that would be the next natural progression, but it will probably not happen overnight.
Okay, perfect. So I think we'll stop here. Just wanted to thank Ganesh and Sanchit for some wonderful insights, fascinating couple of hours in terms of understanding the nuances as well as a broad perspective of how IFSC functions. Definitely a kid which is here to grow well, healthy. On that note, just one announcement before we bid adieu for the day is we have our next session the next week. So we have back-to-back sessions from the IFA SRC. On Saturday, we again have a very unique session in which has been the flavor of IFA SRC, especially once we went into lockdown, because we want to do some non-conventional and interesting, exciting topics. So what we're going to do next Saturday is cover on the recent budget implications in UK and Singapore. So we have an expert from UK and we have an expert from Singapore who will touch upon the budget implications and largely its impact on India INC. So basically the tax considerations that may have for India Inc. with regards to the developments or the tax trends that is happening in the UK as well as the Singapore, largely the Asia Pacific region. So we look forward to seeing you. That's in the morning, which is what normally IFA SRC goes in the morning session. So next Saturday, you'll get information about it. Look forward to seeing you all. Anyway, thank you very much, Anish, Sanchit. It was wonderful listening. Thank you very much all for all those who spent
time. And thank you all for a patient hearing.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Take care and stay safe.
Nice.
Good night.
Nice, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.